I bought the cabin with the idea of escaping things. I'd been grinding through city life for over a decade. It wasn't one of those dramatic, soul-crushing reasons you see in movies. No divorce, no burnout, no breakdown. I just got tired of noise. I got tired of talking. I got tired of pretending to be interested in things I wasn't. I wanted silence, real silence. The kind you only find when the closest person is miles away and your phone doesn't buzz unless you're standing in just the right spot under a power line. So I bought the cabin. Northern Maine, 3 miles off a private dirt road, 35 minutes from the nearest gas station. It sat on 28 acres of mostly forest, with a rough trail leading out to a ridgeline and a shallow stream cutting through the back half of the land. There were no neighbors, not close ones, just quiet woods, thick with old trees and moss and birdsong. I spent the first month doing simple things, fixing the roof, replacing the cracked window panes, scrubbing years of grime off the floors. There was no running water, just a well with a hand pump, and the only power came from a noisy generator I tried to use as little as possible. I read a lot, hiked the property every morning, split wood, ate simple meals, slept better than I had in years. It was during one of those morning hikes that I found the tree. The trail I followed each day wasn't really a trail, more of a habit. I'd loop out behind the cabin, follow the stream for about 100 yards, then cut left and head up a gentle slope toward the northern edge of the property. There was a wire fence at the boundary, mostly rusted and sagging. Beyond that, just more forest, unclaimed, uninhabited as far as I could tell. That morning the light was soft, filtered through mist. I remember the ground was wet, spongy underfoot. I had my boots on, the thick leather ones that came up past my ankles. I remember thinking they made me feel rooted, like I could walk all day and the ground would never get through. I was near the property line, close to the old fence, when I noticed the pine. It didn't look special at first. Big, sure, older than the others, with bark gone silver and black in long vertical scars. But then I got closer and I saw the opening. Right at the base, about 2 feet off the ground, was a hollow dark, wide enough to fit my shoulders, rimmed with pale, dry rot. It looked like something had scraped away the bark over time, enlarging the opening unnaturally. It didn't feel right. Still, I leaned down, put my hand on the edge, and peered inside. Something was in there. I saw it immediately. A shape, bulky, curled against the inner curve of the tree. I pulled my flashlight from my jacket and clicked it on. They were boots, old ones, heavy leather, worn thin in places but still holding shape. They were caked in dried mud. The toes were scuffed raw. One of the laces had rotted clean through, and the other looked like it had been chewed. I reached in and pulled them out. They were stiff in my hands, like they'd been frozen in time. I turned one over and shook it. Nothing. Then the other. A sock slid halfway out, dark with age, almost glued to the leather. And then something fell from the boot. It hit the leaf-covered ground with a tiny, dry clink. A tooth, human by the look of it. Molar yellowed, chipped. There was no way it had belonged to an animal. I stood there a long time, just staring at it. I didn't go back to the cabin right away. I took the boots with me, cradled under one arm, and followed the fence east for a while. I didn't have a reason to. I was just thinking, turning it over in my head. Why would someone leave boots like that inside a tree, with socks still in them? And why a tooth? Why just one? I didn't find anything else. Eventually I went home, put the boots in the shed behind the cabin, and left them there. I told myself I'd deal with them later. Maybe take them into town, ask someone. Maybe burn them. But I didn't do either. They stayed in the shed, and I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about that tree. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it stuck there like a splinter. So I went back. I searched the area more carefully this time, kicked through the leaves, poked into other hollows. I found nothing. No more boots, no bones, no clothes, nothing. But I started noticing other things. The ground near the tree was strange, softer than the rest of the forest. It had a springiness to it, like something had been buried and never settled right. I dug a little with a stick, just to test the idea, but I didn't get far. The dirt smelled wrong, like rot. I left it alone. That night, I heard movement outside. Now, living in the woods, you expect that. Raccoons, deer, maybe a moose if you're lucky. But this was close, heavy, too deliberate. I heard the crunch of footsteps moving past the window, slow and even. I didn't get up. I didn't want to look. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. No tracks, nothing broken, but the shed door was open. I kept that shed latched every time I used it. The wind couldn't have opened it. I stepped inside. The boots were gone. That was the first time I felt something I didn't have a word for. Not fear. Not exactly. It was more like an understanding. Like the woods had opened a crack and let me glimpse something old. Not supernatural. Not evil. Just older than memory. And watching. The days after that were strange. I started noticing the trees leaning in weird directions. One morning, I found a dead squirrel pinned to my front step with a twig. Another morning, I heard something whistling in the forest. Just 2 notes, over and over, always behind me, no matter which way I turned. I stopped hiking the property. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the generator off unless I really needed it. At night, I read with a lantern and kept a loaded rifle beside the bed. But the worst came a week later. I was out near the stream, gathering stones for the fire pit, when I saw something by the water. It looked like clothes. I moved closer, heart already beating fast. It was a jacket, old, moldy, half buried in leaves. Underneath it was a backpack, torn open. The fabric had rotted through, and most of what was inside had been taken by animals or weather. But there were scraps. A corner of a notebook, a rusted can opener, a cracked sunglass lens, and bones. Not a whole skeleton, just a few long ones, femur maybe, finger bone, pale, picked clean. I sat down and stared at them. I don't know how long. An hour? 2? The sun dipped behind the trees. I didn't realize it until the chill started to bite. I left the bones where they were. I walked back slowly, looking over my shoulder the whole way. That night, I took the rifle inside, locked every door, and stayed awake with the light on until morning. I thought about leaving. I even packed a bag, drove to the end of the dirt road. But I didn't go. Something in me needed to stay, needed to know. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's the truth. The next morning, I walked back to the hollow pine. This time, I brought a shovel. The ground resisted me. Just a few inches down, I hit rocks, roots, something wet and black that sucked at the metal. But I kept going. My hands blistered. My back screamed. But I kept digging. And after almost 2 hours, I found something. Cloth. Not the kind that rots easy, something synthetic. A jacket sleeve. I dug more carefully now. Cleared around it. Uncovered a shoulder. A neck. Part of a skull. I stopped. Not out of fear. Not exactly. It was something else. A heaviness. Like I just opened a door and didn't know if I could close it again. I filled the hole back in. I didn't call anyone. Not then. I couldn't explain why. Maybe part of me thought no one would believe me. Maybe part of me didn't want them to. I moved back to the city 6 weeks later. Sold the cabin at a loss to a young couple from out of state. I never told them about the boots, or the tooth, or the body beneath the pine. I still think about it. Sometimes I wake up at night and smell the rot. I hear the 2-note whistle in my dreams. Sometimes I wonder if I left something behind that I shouldn't have. Or maybe something came with me, but mostly I just remember the tree, that hollow mouth, those stiff boots, the tooth in the dirt, and I wonder how many others have found it, and how many never came back. I took the cabin for 2 months. It was a seasonal rental, deep in the hills of western Pennsylvania. Not a tourist spot, not a resort town. Just thick forest, steep ridgelines, and old logging roads barely passable in dry weather. I found the listing through a guy at work who knew the owner. Off-grid, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, well water, solar panels for light use, and a propane tank out back for the stove and hot water heater. A wood stove for heat. I'd bring my own food, my own books, and get away from everything for a while. The cabin itself sat on a little shelf of land halfway up a slope. Narrow, gravel driveway that wound like a snake through trees so close they slapped the side mirrors. When I got there, the grass around the place was long, unkempt. Looked like no one had been there in a season or two. Paint on the wood siding was flaking away, and there was moss growing between the planks of the deck. I liked that, though. It meant quiet. It meant no neighbors. No one else around to ask questions or make noise. Inside, the place was small. One room and a short hallway with a bathroom at the end. Bed in one corner, couch near the wood stove, table and 2 chairs under the window, kitchenette tucked against the far wall. Just enough space to cook something simple, boil water, wash a few plates. The walls were pine, stained dark with age. It smelled like old wood and cold ash from the stove. My plan was to spend my time reading, writing, walking, and doing absolutely nothing productive. I'd stocked the cooler with meat, eggs, and cheese, brought up a crate of canned goods, and filled a duffel with paperbacks. First week passed peacefully. I made coffee every morning, took long walks along the ridges, explored some of the old hunting trails that curved out from behind the cabin. No one around, not a car, not a voice, not even a distant chainsaw. Just wind through the trees and the occasional crow. But in the second week, something started to change. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint smell on my shirt, metallic like rusted iron or dried blood. I'd been chopping wood that day, so I figured I'd rubbed against something. Sap maybe, sweat. I tossed the shirt in the plastic bin I was using for laundry and didn't think much of it. Next day, same thing. Different shirt, different pants. Same smell, stronger. I sniffed the armpits, the collar, the cuffs, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Couldn't pin it down. Just a general sourness. Tangy, like copper pennies soaked in vinegar. The kind of smell that catches the back of your throat. I washed the clothes in a bucket with soap, rinsed them with bottled water, hung them outside to dry on the line that stretched between the porch post and a pine tree. When I brought them back in the next day, they still smelled. Maybe worse. I checked the water tank. Thought maybe something had gotten into the plumbing. Dead animal, mold, sediment. I even tried tasting the water. Seemed clean. No color, no odor, no taste. I ran the taps for several minutes, flushed everything out. But the smell on my clothes only got stronger. I tried using bottled water exclusively for a while. I bathed from a jug, washed dishes in it, brushed my teeth with it. I even wiped down the counters, the floor, the inside of the cooler. I started to wonder if maybe there was something in the cabin itself. Mold spores, bad insulation, dead rodents under the floor. I stripped the bed, aired out the mattress, wiped down the walls. Nothing helped. By the end of the second week, the smell was in everything. It was on my skin, in my nose. I couldn't escape it. It was like I was steeped in it. Every time I moved, I caught a fresh whiff. Metallic, acrid, sour. I burned the shirt I'd worn the first day I noticed it, tossed it in the fire pit and lit a match. The smoke reeked. I started sleeping outside on the porch. Even then, it stayed with me. I stopped going on walks. I didn't want the smell to cling to the trees, to follow me deeper into the woods. I started waking up at night with my heart pounding. Not because of dreams, because of the air. Couldn't breathe. I throw off the blankets, gasp fresh air, and still smell it. Not rot, not death, not something explainable like decay. Just this strange, sharp tang like rust and sweat and something else. Something unnatural but not supernatural. That's what made it worse, because there was nothing magical about it. No shadow in the corner, no whispering voice, no figures in the trees, just this goddamn smell. Constant, inescapable, and stronger every day. By the fourth week, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, left the cabin just after dawn, drove down the mountain with the windows open, trying to flush the stink off me. The gravel road shook the smell into my nostrils like someone had soaked my clothes in vinegar. I stopped at a gas station an hour down the highway, went into the bathroom and washed my face. I looked in the mirror and saw the bags under my eyes, the red streaks at the corners. My hands smelled like pennies. I scrubbed them with soap until the skin went raw. It wasn't until I got home, 3 hours later, back in the suburbs, that I noticed the smell was gone. I'd walked into my house expecting to bring it with me. I even warned myself, don't unpack your bag right away, don't sit on anything soft. But after 5 minutes inside, I realized I couldn't smell it anymore. I lifted my shirt to my nose. Nothing. I sniffed my wrist. Just soap. It was like someone had flipped a switch the moment I crossed the county line. I thought about it for days. Told myself maybe it was something in the air up there. A type of mold or some reaction in the water table. Maybe something leaching from the pipes or the wood in the walls. But no matter how much I read, I couldn't find an answer. There was no reason for that smell to cling to my clothes for weeks, through washes, through clean water, then vanish instantly when I left. And it wasn't just the absence of smell. It was the way it vanished, like it had been unhooked from me. I tried not to think about it. But one afternoon, a few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address, just a short note, folded inside a plain envelope. If the smell is gone, don't go back, even for your things. Just don't. I froze. There was no name, no signature, just that line. I hadn't told anyone, not about the cabin, not about the smell, not a single person. I kept it to myself, thinking it was just something weird, something my body had reacted to in a strange way. I had left most of my stuff up there, too. Books, some gear, the cooler, the hatchet, a sleeping bag. I hadn't planned on going back for it, but the letter made it feel final. I threw the note away, burned it in the sink, flushed the ashes, tried to convince myself it was someone messing with me, but it didn't feel like that. Felt like a warning. 2 days later, curiosity got the better of me. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't even drive north. I looked it up on the county website, parcel map, owner information, tax records, and that's when I saw the pattern. The owner, an older man named Barris, had listed the cabin for short-term rent for nearly 6 years. Before me, there had been dozens of renters, all seasonal. None stayed more than a few weeks. I started pulling names where I could. Not easy, some paid cash, some used middlemen, but I tracked down 3 of them through social media and email. I never got a reply. One profile had been inactive for over a year. Another was marked in memory of. The third had a post from a family member saying she'd taken an extended break and wasn't answering messages. I left it alone after that. There's no mystery in this. Nothing to solve. No twist ending where I discover a body under the floorboards or find an old newspaper article about a murder on the land. The truth is simpler than that. More disturbing, in a way. Something up there left a mark on me. Not a ghost. Not a monster. Just something real. Maybe the way old mines leak iron into groundwater. Maybe some fungus in the soil that clings to clothing. Maybe something human we don't talk about because we don't want to know it's there. Whatever it was, it lived in that cabin. In the walls, in the wood, in the land. And for a while, it tried to live in me. The smell was never the point. It was just the part one could sense. A symptom. I never went back. Never told anyone. I still have the clothes from that trip, stored in a garbage bag in the garage. Once in a while, I open it, just to check. They still smell clean, but I don't trust them, and I never will. I rented the cabin for 3 weeks. It wasn't one of those cute little Airbnb getaways you see in vacation blogs. No string lights on the porch. No Instagram-friendly blankets draped across leather chairs. It was just old wood, old nails, and the kind of silence that made you realize how much noise you'd grown used to in your normal life. I picked it because it was cheap, remote. The owner didn't ask questions, just emailed me a code to a padlock and told me I'd have to bring my own firewood and water. He claimed there was a spring a mile downhill, but I brought a 12-gallon jugs just in case. The first 2 days were good. I stayed mostly inside, trying to fix my sleep schedule, eating from cans, walking the trail behind the cabin that led down through a gully where squirrels moved like phantoms between branches. My phone got no signal, which I knew ahead of time. I had a solar charger and some downloaded podcasts. Nothing urgent needed doing. I told people I was going off-grid for a bit. Don't worry if I go dark. That was the phrase I used. I didn't notice the drawer until the third day. It was in the kitchen. The whole setup was from the 70s, stained Formica counters, cracked tile, those deep drawers with the rounded aluminum handles. All of them opened easily except one. It wasn't locked, just taped shut. A strip of dull black electrical tape ran along the top seam. Old, brittle at the ends. Not some recent job. More like it had been that way for a long time, maybe years. It wasn't the kind of tape that holds strong either. Just a little resistance when I tugged. I ignored it at first. I wasn't there to snoop, and it wasn't my property. But something about it bugged me. It wasn't taped because of damage. I could tell that just by looking. It wasn't broken. The other drawers wobbled, sagged on their tracks, but this one sat firm, square, clean almost, like someone had cared more about it than the rest of the kitchen. By the end of the day, curiosity won. I peeled the tape off in one smooth motion. The sound of it lifting was sharper than expected, like it had bonded deeper than electrical tape usually does. I pulled the drawer open slowly, half expecting it to be stuck, but it slid easy. Inside were paper towels, not loose, folded deliberately into squares. I remember that clearly. They sat stacked too deep across the drawer. No dust, no cobwebs, no insects. Strange in a place like this, where the rest of the cabin had been chewed and cluttered by time. I picked one up. It was heavier than it looked. I unfolded it on the counter. Inside was a single metal nail. Short, rusted, the kind you'd use in floorboards. Nothing sharp enough to use as a weapon, nothing long enough for structural use. The next one had a staple. The third, a twisted paperclip. Each wrapped alone in its own folded napkin, like someone had taken the time to carefully, methodically, separate and hide them. But it was the fourth one that made my stomach turn. Inside it was an earring, just one. A small stud like a child's. Dull silver, dried brown crust packed around the clasp. Blood or something else. I didn't want to smell it. I didn't want to hold it any longer than I had to. I set it aside and reached deeper into the drawer. Under the last folded towel was a sheet of paper. Rough, thin, maybe torn from a notepad or a manual. The letters were written in all caps with black ink. Sharp, hard-pressed. You could see where the pen had almost punctured the paper. 2 words. Stop opening. I remember standing there, staring at that message for a long time, not moving. The drawer open in front of me, towel stacks ruined, metal bits scattered on the counter, and that paper just sitting there like a warning I'd already broken. I didn't sleep that night. The air inside the cabin felt different. Not colder exactly, just heavy, like the oxygen was thicker, harder to breathe. I kept the flashlight in my hand under the blanket and turned it on every hour just to check the door. Nothing changed. No sounds. No movement. But it felt wrong. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. A prank. Maybe some old owner hiding things away. The earring was probably a weird accident. People collect all kinds of strange things, especially in places like this. It didn't mean anything, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. Stop opening. Why phrase it like that? Why not keep out or do not open? The way it was worded made it feel personal, like someone had been watching and saw me do it. I tried to go on with the day. Went for a walk, chopped some firewood, made a quick meal from beans and rice. But every time I passed the kitchen, I saw that drawer, that gaping open space, like a wound in the cabinets. That night, I couldn't stop myself. I went through the drawer again, carefully, one item at a time, refolding the towels, checking each metal piece, trying to see if there was any kind of pattern, anything to make it make sense. But there wasn't, just random junk. Each piece old, scratched, grimy in the same way, like it had been touched by someone who didn't care about what it meant, just that it was kept together. I even tried checking under the drawer, pulling it fully out to look at the cabinet base. Empty, just dust. I opened the drawers to either side, looking for a false panel or some hidden compartment. That's when I saw the second note. It was taped behind the drawer next to it, folded tight. Just 2 words again, same blocky handwriting. You were warned. I didn't sleep again. That was the 5th night. I started hearing things after that. Little sounds that didn't belong. A drawer shifting, a click of metal on wood, the soft scrape like something was being moved across a floor. I told myself it was the wind, animals, settling wood, but the sounds didn't happen during the day, only at night, only between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always when I was in bed, always when I hadn't moved for a while. I started staying awake later and later trying to catch it. I'd sit up in bed in the dark, no lights, just listening. But it always started when I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore, like something waited. On the 8th night, I nailed the drawer shut. I didn't know what else to do. I found an old box of nails in the shed out back. 3 heavy nails hammered into the top lip of the drawer, straight through the face into the frame. It split a bit from the pressure, but it held. I slept better that night, but not for long. On the 10th day, I went outside to take a piss and saw something that made my chest go tight. In the dirt under the front window, where the soft pine needles usually sat undisturbed, there were tracks. Fresh ones, not boots, bare feet, bare, adult feet. The shape was unmistakable. Clean impressions in the soil. 5 toes, heel, arch. They led up to the window, stopped there, and didn't turn around. I stood over them for maybe 10 minutes, trying to explain them, trying to find a second trail. But there wasn't one, just those feet, just those prints, and no others leading away. I went back inside, barricaded the doors, closed the shutters on the windows and nailed them shut. That afternoon, I packed everything into my duffel except what I needed for one more night. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I had to be absolutely sure. That night, just after 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the drawer opening. Not fast, not loud, just the creak of the wood and the shuffle of something being moved, unfolded. I couldn't move. My whole body locked. I heard metal tapping, like nails dropped slowly, one by one, onto the countertop. Then the sound of paper sliding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't even breathe deep until dawn. When the sun came through the cracks in the shutters, I got up and walked slowly to the kitchen. The drawer was open again. The nails I had driven into it were on the counter, neatly placed in a line. The folded towels had been rearranged, not thrown around, stacked. And on top of the stack was another paper. Same handwriting, only this time 3 words. Not yours to open. That was it. That was enough. I packed the rest of my gear in silence, opened the shutters and left without looking back. I hiked to the truck with my heart in my throat. Every sound behind me sounded like someone stepping just out of sight. I never reported it. What would I say? No crime had been committed. Nothing stolen. Nothing broken. Just a drawer filled with metal scraps and warnings. But I never went back. And sometimes when I'm up late, when the wind comes in through the vents and makes the house creak the way that cabin did, I think about that drawer. I think about who sealed it, why they warned me, and what else might have been buried beneath the paper towels under that bottom sheet. What I would have found if I had just kept opening. I drove up to the cabin alone that weekend. I'd rented it off an old coworker who barely used it anymore. He said it was small, nothing fancy, just a single-room place with a cot, a stove, and a wood-burning fireplace, way out in the woods, a couple of miles from the nearest county road. That was what I wanted. I'd been getting burnout lately, trying to keep up with work, texts, emails, a life that never let up. My phone was off before I even left the car. I didn't want a screen in front of my face. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. The drive-in was rough. The forest road had almost vanished from disuse. I scratched the hell out of the sides of my car from the brush and thorns. The cabin didn't even have a parking spot. I just pulled off at the widest part of the trail and walked the last 50 yards in. It looked like it hadn't been touched in months. The wood was faded. Moss grew thick around the base and up the chimney. The steps creaked. Inside, everything smelled like pine needles and old dust. There was no electricity, no water, but the cot was dry and the fireplace hadn't caved in. A few simple tools leaned in a corner. A splitting maul, a small hatchet, an old hunting knife in a cracked leather sheath. I left my duffel on the floor and opened all the windows to get some fresh air moving. I didn't even lock the car behind me. There wasn't another soul around for miles. That first day, I kept it simple. I chopped wood. I boiled water I'd brought in jugs. I sat outside for a few hours with a thermos of coffee and just watched the woods. The trees were tall and thick here, birch and pine mostly. There was a loop trail that led out from behind the cabin. My coworker had said it was maybe a mile long. A small path he and his dad used to take when they hunted deer up here. I walked a little of it just to stretch my legs and make sure it was still passable. The undergrowth was heavy in some spots, and in others it vanished entirely. I couldn't believe how fast the forest reclaimed its ground. Places that probably had trails 5 years ago now looked like no one had walked them in a decade. The first night was quiet. I fell asleep early. The air cooled quickly after sundown, and the fire I made was more for light than warmth, but I liked the crackling sound. I'd brought a cheap sleeping bag and a foam pad, and even though the cot sagged in the middle, I slept deep. The next morning, I started thinking about doing the full loop trail. It had rained sometime in the night, just enough to make the leaves slick, and I didn't want to take any chances getting turned around. The trail wasn't well marked, and I'd read stories about people getting lost on simple hikes, just a mile from camp, because everything started to look the same. I had a roll of red string in my pack. It was the kind used for crafts or maybe tagging gear, bright, unwaxed, thin. I tied the first piece to a low branch near the cabin, double knotted it, and then every 30 feet or so I tied another, always on the right-hand side of the trail. If I ever got lost or needed to backtrack, I figured I could just keep the strings on my left and walk back in. It took maybe an hour to do the loop. I kept the pace easy, stopping to check out some weird mushrooms growing at the base of a dead pine, and once when I saw a set of tracks in the mud, probably raccoon, maybe a fox. I felt good out there, nobody around, nothing artificial, just the trees, my breath, and the crunch of wet leaves underfoot. By the time I circled back to the cabin, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. That afternoon, I made another fire, boiled some instant noodles, and read a book until the light started to go. Around sunset, I walked out to the start of the loop again. The first red string I tied was gone. Not cut, not hanging loose, just gone. I figured it must have slipped off. Bad knot, maybe, or the branch bent and it slid free. I didn't think much of it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't fear or noise. It was too quiet, actually. No insects, no rustling. The wind had died completely. It was the kind of stillness that made you realize how much sound the world usually has. The kind of stillness that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. At some point in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something outside, just a quick rustle of brush. I sat up, held my breath, and waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon rooting through the duffel I'd left on the porch. I didn't have food in there, just clothes, but they didn't know that. The next morning, I went out to hike the loop again. I figured it would be a good routine, once in the morning, once at sunset. I brought a walking stick this time and wore my heavier boots. I figured maybe I'd add new red strings in the spots I'd missed or where the knots had slipped. But there weren't any red strings. Not a single one. I walked the whole loop. Took me almost 2 hours because I kept stopping, circling back, checking the base of trees and the brush nearby, thinking maybe they'd fallen or the wind had carried them. But it wasn't windy, and the branches I'd tied to hadn't moved. The bark still had faint impressions from the knots, but every single piece of string was gone. Now I started to feel off. Something wasn't right. Even if the knots were all bad, which I doubted, there should have been at least a few scraps lying around. Maybe 1 or 2 missing, sure. But all of them? All 20 or 30? I did the loop again, slower. This time I counted every step and checked every branch. No sign of them. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was sweating even though the air was cool. My hands were shaking. I sat on the porch with a thermos of cold water and stared into the trees. I didn't have an explanation, and the lack of one made it worse. I didn't sleep that night. I laid on the cot with my knife on my chest and the fire down low. Every few minutes I thought I heard something moving outside. The sound was never close, just faint crunches in the leaves. Then silence again. The fourth morning, I told myself I was done hiking the trail. I wasn't going to play games with myself in the woods. I made breakfast. I tried to read. I watched the trees, but I kept thinking about the string. I still had more in my pack, and I kept thinking maybe I'd gone crazy. Maybe I hadn't tied them as well as I remembered. Maybe some animal had taken them. Birds, squirrels, something. So I tried it again. One last time. I tied new strings, tighter knots. This time I marked each one with a small notch on the branch using the knife, so I'd know exactly where they'd been tied. 30 feet apart. Each one a bright red mark against the green and brown. The hike took longer. I kept turning around, double-checking. After the first 5 markers, I felt a little better. They were all holding. No signs of tampering. I looped around and headed back toward the cabin. About halfway through, the 6th marker was gone. The string was missing, but the notch in the branch was still there. I froze. I checked the ground. Nothing. I checked the next tree. That string was gone too. So was the one after that. I turned around. The ones behind me were still there. That's when I started running. I ran the rest of the way back to the cabin, crashing through brush, tripping once, scraping my hand on a rock. My chest was tight, my eyes darting everywhere. When I made it back to the clearing, I stopped at the edge of the tree line. There was a piece of red string tied to the front doorknob. Just one, tied with the same knot I used. The cabin door was closed, but something about it felt off. I waited. I listened. I didn't hear anything inside, but I didn't go up the steps. I just stood there. Then I backed away, slow, step by step. I didn't go back inside. I left my duffel. I left the food, the water, everything. I walked to the car and started it without looking back at the cabin. The drive out felt longer. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't check my phone until I was 20 miles away and had full service again. Nothing had changed. No new texts. No missed calls. I didn't call the police. What would I say? Someone untied my string? Someone might have been in the cabin? They'd laugh me out of the station. But I never went back. I never told my coworker what happened. I just said I wasn't interested in another weekend out there. He didn't press it. To this day, I don't know who or what removed those strings. I don't know who tied the last one on the doorknob. Maybe someone else was out there, living off the trail. Someone who didn't like being followed. Someone who watched me walking in circles in their woods, leaving bright red flags behind. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gone back into that cabin. Maybe nothing, but I wasn't going to find out. I never use markers when I hike anymore, and I never go into the woods alone. I rented the cabin for a month. I found it through a small ad on a local forum. No pictures, just a short description. Quiet retreat in the mountains. Running water would heat. Available November. Inquire by email. It was cheap, dirt cheap really, and it sat alone on a 10-acre patch of overgrown woodland. The only neighbors were trees, moss, and the occasional crow. That was exactly what I wanted. I needed space to think, space to reset. When I first pulled up the dirt road, it looked like no one had stayed there in years. Weeds grew up through the gravel, and the grass on either side of the house was brown and long and packed with old, curled leaves. The cabin itself was a squat wooden thing with a wraparound porch, half of which sagged a little on one side. The steps creaked when I walked up, and I noticed right away that the front door didn't sit quite flush in the frame. There was a faint gap at the top right corner where wind had whistled through, but it was quiet. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears once you've driven away from traffic and streetlights. The kind of quiet that wraps around you and sinks in deep. Inside, it was simple. A wood stove, a kitchen with an old gas burner, a bedroom with a lumpy mattress, and a small bathroom with just enough water pressure to rinse your hands. I didn't mind. I was there for the solitude. The view out back looked down a short hill toward a tangle of trees and brush that ended in a thick creek bed. The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked groceries. I fixed the crooked door with a shim. I chopped some wood and built a fire each night. My phone had no service out there, so I kept it off most of the time. I read, I slept, I walked the property. I made a little ritual out of sweeping the porch and raking the yard for an hour every morning. That's how I found the flip phone. I was working under the front steps, trying to clear a thick patch of wet leaves that had jammed into the gaps between the boards. When I pulled a clump free, something slid out with it. A small, black flip phone. Old, scratched up, but not broken. It landed face up on the dirt with the hinge slightly open. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. When I flipped it open, the screen lit up. There was still battery left. 3 bars. The menu was locked, just a simple password prompt for digits, but I could get into the contacts list. Only one entry was there, just a single letter, C. I stared at it for a while. No call log, no messages, just that name and the battery meter ticking slowly down. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone had dropped it. Maybe a hunter or a worker from years ago. I set it on the porch railing and kept working. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of the phone, I just felt uneasy. The wind picked up around 2 in the morning and howled through the trees. The fire had died down to embers. I kept thinking I heard something shift on the porch. The usual creaks. Probably nothing. The next morning, when I stepped outside to get wood, I saw the phone again. It wasn't on the railing anymore. It was back under the steps. Same spot, same angle, same thin crust of dirt on the screen, like it had never been moved. I pulled it out, opened it. Battery full. For bars now. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions. I figured maybe I was tired the day before and just left it there without thinking. Maybe the wind knocked it off the porch and it bounced weird. But under the same steps? That was a stretch. Still, I didn't panic. I set it on the porch again. Not the railing this time. I put it on a small plastic chair by the door. That day I went for a hike down toward the creek bed. The path was overgrown but still visible if you looked for broken branches and old impressions in the dirt. I followed it for an hour all the way to the edge of the property and found a small stone ring, maybe an old fire pit. I sat there for a while watching the trees sway. When I came back, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The air had gone cold. The phone was back under the steps. Still clean, still open, still showing 4 bars of battery. I stared at it for a long time, crouched on the dirt, just looking at it like it might blink or move. I didn't touch it this time. I just backed away and sat on the porch steps. That night, I barely slept. Every creak outside made me hold my breath. I kept the wood stove going until it was nearly morning. My nerves were shot, but I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. Just that damn phone again and again in the same spot. On the 4th day, I brought it inside. I placed it on the kitchen counter right next to the sink. I turned the screen off and left it there. I didn't look at it the rest of the day. I swept the cabin. I made tea. I read until my eyes burned. In the morning, it was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced, just gone. The counter was clean, the sink empty. I stepped outside and felt cold air rush across my face. It was under the steps, same exact spot. I picked it up, battery full, no signs of being touched. I tried to think logically. Could someone be messing with me? There weren't any tire tracks on the road. The cabin was isolated enough that even hikers would have had a hell of a time finding it. And who would go through the trouble? There was nothing to steal, no valuables, no tools left outside. Just me, my books, a bag of groceries, and that phone. That day, I walked the perimeter. I looked for footprints, disturbed brush, broken branches. Anything. Nothing. No signs anyone had been there but me. The ground was soft from the recent rain, but the only tracks I found were mine. I decided not to touch the phone again. Not until I had more information. I left it under the steps. The next morning, it wasn't there. And it wasn't on the porch. It was in the cabin. It was sitting dead center on my pillow. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, staring at it. The cabin door was still locked. The windows hadn't been forced. I walked the entire place twice, heart hammering in my chest, checking for signs of entry. Nothing. Just the phone. Just the battery at 4 bars. Just the single contact. C. That day, I packed my things. Not because I believed the place was haunted, I don't believe in that crap, but because something wasn't right. Someone had to be getting inside. Someone who had a key. Someone who knew the area. Maybe the person who'd placed the ad. Maybe someone who knew the cabin had been empty for a while. I threw my bags in the car and turned the ignition. Nothing. Dead battery. It had worked fine the day before. I checked under the hood, no signs of tampering. Just no charge. I didn't have jumper cables. The closest town was 15 miles away. I went back inside and tried the landline. There was none. No cell service. That night, I sat in the kitchen with the hatchet on the table. The phone sat across from me, still lit, still full of battery. I tried every code I could think of. 0000, 1234, 9999. Birthdays. Nothing worked. I took it outside and left it on the gravel 20 feet from the porch. In the morning, I stepped outside. It was under the steps. I didn't bother picking it up. I didn't sweep the porch. I didn't rake leaves. I just sat in the kitchen all day thinking. Someone was playing with me, watching, testing my reaction. Maybe they wanted to scare me. Maybe they were trying to get me to leave. It was working. I waited for nightfall. When the sun dipped low, I wrapped the phone in a rag, took it into the woods, and buried it under a heavy rock 2 feet down. I packed the dirt tight, rolled the rock back into place, and stomped the earth until my legs ached. I walked back to the cabin in the dark, without a flashlight. Every branch that scraped my arms made me jump. Every owl hoot or snap of a twig made me clench my fists. I barely slept. When I woke up, the phone was under the steps again. Clean. Not a speck of dirt on it. Screen open. Battery full. That was it for me. I left the cabin on foot, packed a small bag, took water, and followed the dirt road out. I walked for 5 hours before a ranger found me along the edge of the state park boundary. I told him I was out hiking, got turned around. He gave me a ride into town, and I hitched back home a day later. I never told anyone about the phone. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never contacted the person who listed it. 2 weeks later, a padded envelope showed up at my apartment. No return address. Inside was the flip phone, still lit, still showing one contact, C. I threw it in the trash that same day, drove it across town and dropped it into a dumpster behind an auto shop. The next morning, I stepped out for coffee. The phone was on my front steps. Underneath it was a note, written in neat, block letters on plain white paper. Stop moving it. I haven't touched it since. It's still out there. I've moved 3 times since then. It always finds me,